Throughout history, a lot of wars have happened all around the world, small and big, modern and old. But one of these wars is probably one of the most terrifying wars, World War I. World War I was one of the first major war where modern technology and weaponry was used. Weapons like machine guns, mortars, bombs, flamethrowers, tanks. Another weird thing that had never happened before was that millions of young people were participating in it, something that was much more damaging than the weapons itself. Shell shock. The doctors that were examining these soldiers early in World War I were the people that came up with the term shell-shocked. A soldier that has not been hit or exploded, but something is damaged in their mind. If you read the reports from different doctors throughout World War I, it is written that the soldier is terrified of everything. They're shaking. Sometimes they can't even speak. And altogether, their mind is racing with stressful thoughts. So stressed that they can't even speak. Or even stressed enough that you get paralyzed. You can't even walk or speak. The reason the problem was called shell shock is because the doctors back then thought it's the shock of the shells that caused this to happen to their mindset. So it basically happens after a nearby explosion, hence why it's called shell shock. In the beginning of the war, anybody that got shell shock, they would let them go home so they can rest and come back. But the amount of people that had shell shock started to rise, and it started to rise quickly, where almost every soldier is complaining about it. This is when the commanders throughout the battles started to get suspicious. They would think that these soldiers are trying to escape the war and not fight for their country. They would say this soldier wasn't even next to an explosion. How would he get shell shocked? This is when they started calling these soldiers scared soldiers or cowards. Anybody that had shell shock from then on forward would be called a coward. The soldiers that would be shell shocked started to rise drastically, and this is when the commanders had enough. They said anybody that complains about this condition or says they have it, they will be executed for treason. If you look at World War I history, different countries throughout the world executed their soldiers for complaining about shell shock because they thought they're committing treason. The worst part was when newspapers would report on it, they would say a scared little soldier got executed because he was faking being shell shocked, and they would look at that as treason. It got to a point where the newspapers weren't even mentioning the term shell shock. They would just say the soldier was scared, and for that he got executed. It wasn't just the gunfight, the fires, the flamethrowers, and the mortars that would cause these soldiers to have shell shock. It was mostly the condition of the trenches and the environment they were in. Trenches that were filled up with water and mud. There are rats everywhere. Shoes and clothes are all ripped apart. It's extremely cold, and it has been months since you had a warm meal. The conditions would damage them even more than the war itself. After a couple years into the war, they were forced to hire different doctors to look into this condition of shell shock, and they were trying to figure out a way to fix these soldiers and send them back to the battlefield. The first method they came up with, anybody that wants to act like they have shell shock, the best thing to do is to beat them senseless, and that would bring them back. For a while they would beat these soldiers, and of course it wasn't helping anybody, and it would worsen their condition. They realized that this is doing nothing, so they started shocking them with an electric chair. A doctor by the name of Louis Yeeland was the one that came up with this idea. and he thought he came up with an amazing idea that would actually help these soldiers, but he was actually making them suffer even harder. He would even say that 80% of these soldiers will be fixed after getting shocked, but of course they only suffered even more. Louis Yeland had endless ideas. He would say to get better result, you have to inspect the patient. Anywhere that shakes the most, which is usually the hands, you have to apply the electricity there. If they can't speak, you have to apply electricity to their throat. And after that charge, they will start speaking. This reminds me of the lobotomy, one of the most unusual and terrifying surgeries in history that was so accepted, it actually won a Nobel Prize. Probably the most ridiculous Nobel Prize in history. When you look at all of Louis Yeland's ideas, you realize that every single one is supposed to make these soldiers suffer even more. He had endless ideas. Another idea he had is to put these soldiers into a dark room and play loud noises, and that will help them start to think. These types of tortures are known as cures at this time, until a doctor named William Halls Rivers came along, and he started to have a tiny better of an idea on how to fix these soldiers. He would tell the other doctors that what the hell are you guys doing? Why are you shocking and beating these guys senseless? You have to start talking to them and ask them, why are you thinking like this and what makes you feel like this? If you talk to them, maybe, just maybe, they would make sense of it and start to think clearly. When William Rivers entered the scene on fixing these soldiers, every single doctor was torturing these guys. William Rivers would say, this is not the way. My method will be so good, we would even be able to send these guys back into the battlefield. Rivers' method was much better than the other guys, but he was completely wrong, because fixing a person with shell shock was the most difficult thing you can think of, and it wasn't as simple as he thought. William Rivers would speak to all types of patients with shell shock, and he slowly realized that this is more complicated than I thought, because the human psyche is so complicated that nobody really knows what's going on there. After World War I was over, hundreds of thousands of soldiers would have to go to the doctor for shell shock. But experts believe that this figure was much higher at this time, because a lot of soldiers had this condition, but they were so embarrassed of it that they wouldn't go to the doctor to get help. Unfortunately, any soldier that had this type of condition, they would end up in insane asylums. They would be treated poorly, or if they were lucky and had a family member, they would be taken care of by them. The more time passes, the more doctors and people realize that this is a serious problem and it's not acting whatsoever. The human mind is extremely fragile and you could damage it so easily. This is not something where you can fix by beating someone or sending them to the insane asylum. After doctors realized how serious being shell shock is, they completely changed the name of it. Since it wasn't called shell shock anymore, the name was post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. PTSD doesn't only happen in war. It could happen during an accident, an earthquake, or any other tragic event. But the first name of this condition, meaning shell shock, has to remind us every day how tragic war is. And you shouldn't be pro-war or wish war on anybody.